Settle in, maybe grab a coffee, a latte. This is going to be a longer video, but it's got some critical information in it that we need to know for 2022. Today, we're going to talk about something that I know is going to be a problem all throughout 2022. Hopefully, we get this resolved by the end of 2022. It's always been a problem, but it's going to be bigger because now we're coming back to these in-person events. And specifically, it's going to be a bigger issue, I predict, in schools than it will be for nonprofits. But in either case, if you are using volunteers to really run your event, I mean, like it ultimately is a volunteer. There is no professional staff person, although it can happen with staff too. This is a problem. And it has to do with your sound system. Now, sound has always been one of these things that as an auctioneer, I find it difficult to convey to clients how important the audio is. It's one of those things that until you experience it personally, you just don't get it. But once you experience it and you see how bad it can get, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. Now I'm gonna share some examples here, but I want to also kind of dive a little bit into why I think it's so difficult for people to spend money on sound. It's kind of like insulation in your house or some other things that are behind the scenes, maybe roofing, maybe plumbing. It's one of those things that you're like, oh man, if you don't see it, you hate to spend money on it, right? You kind of regret later, but at the time you don't want to invest the money in it because you're like, oh, I hate to spend that much money on something that you just don't even see. But later the insulation can really help you making your house more comfortable, in lowering your electric bills, all that kind of stuff. Well, that's how I feel like sound is in a lot of cases for people who are planning benefit auctions. And they just don't recognize the importance of it until it's a little bit too late. So to back this up, and the reason I think that with volunteers, it could be more of a struggle is because with our private schools in particular, we have, in many cases, volunteers, moms usually, who are running these events, and they change every year. So if I'm the new gala chair and I'm looking at the budget generally from the prior year, and I don't see that a lot of money is spent on sound or none at all, maybe they used the DJ system, it's all rolled into one cost, then I don't want to be the mom who suddenly has to bring in more sound, especially if I didn't experience what happened the prior year for bad sound. See, now it's interesting because this past weekend I had a school auction. It's a tough venue. A lot of venues are difficult for sound, but this was one of those. And with schools, they're coming back together. These parents are so excited to be together. They know each other. In some cases, this is their first auction. I talked about that 2 weeks ago. These parents are coming. It's their very first auction. They're anxious to be out and socializing with other parents. They're loud. But it worked out pretty well this past weekend because there were 3 co-chairs. 2 of them were in the front of the room and they could hear, but then one was in the back of the room and immediately ran up to the front and said, "We can't hear anything that's going on back there." So I think next year we're going to have better sound in that space because some of these will carry through the continuity. They're young moms, so I think they're going to be involved. They'll be able to influence what's going to happen next year with the sound in this space, should they choose to go to the same venue. So that's why I think it's sometimes difficult too in these school environments, because you've got someone who doesn't want to spend more than they did last year because you're just trying to do the best by the school. You want to make the most money for the school. And if I'm looking at the budget from the prior year, I'm like, well, they didn't spend a lot of money last year. I don't want to spend this money this year. I want my net income, my gross income to look good compared to last year, ideally get more. So there's just a little, it's kind of working against ourselves in that case. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about sound though, and impart my knowledge. I don't pretend to be an expert in sound, but you know what? I'm not an expert in vehicles either, and I can drive a car. So I'll share with you a little bit of what I've learned over the years. Dating back to 2011, I had attended an event. We call it the BAS Summit, the Benefit Auctioneers Specialist Summit. It's put on by the National Auctioneers Association. And this may have been the first one in Baltimore in 2011. And we had a gentleman come in. His name is Bruce Marlin. I just looked him up on LinkedIn. He's still around, although it looks like he might be semi-retired. I'm not real sure. Lives down in Dallas. I think he moved because I feel like he was in the Midwest or something before. But he came out and he was senior vice president of engineering for Atlas sound. And they may even call it like the technology was something different, but the My Tech maybe is what it was called. But Atlas sound was what I remembered. And Bruce came out and he talked about how, look, he says, and he's the SVP of engineering. Keep this in mind. He knows the speakers. He's like, we put a lot of speakers into hotels. When hotels are going up, sound systems going in. He said, it's our speakers that go in to a lot of these hotels. They are not appropriate for your auction. Overhead speakers, the way, again, this gets into physics beyond my ability to explain perhaps in scientific levels, but generally speaking, when you have those speakers in the ceiling, the sound waves are not close enough, so to speak, to the eardrum, so that by the time they actually reach someone down here in the ballroom floor, that sound is not as clear and crisp as what you need for an auction. It might be fine if the room was silent. And he said that. He said, you know, they're perfect for the Rotary breakfast meeting. If you've got a wedding and everybody goes ding, 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 and quiets the room so that everybody's paying attention to the toast that's going to be made to the new couple, fine. But auctions aren't like that, he said. Auctions are the equivalent, the sound decibel level is the equivalent of a small rock concert. So you've got to get above that level so that guests can hear with clarity and distinction. Because in the case of an auction, it's not enough to just hear boom, ba-da, boom, ba-da, boom, ba-da, boom. You know, that, hey, music, great, no worries. You don't have to know the lyrics to the song, but you need to understand what the auctioneer is saying because your money is on the line. You want to know, am I raising my hand for $2,500 or what? I can't hear. And if people can't hear, they won't bid. If they're confused, you're not going to get them to a point of decision. And that decision is raising their hand to bid or to make a donation. If they're not invested because they couldn't hear, they're checked out in the back, which is what we had happen. So what I am going to say on this idea of sound, you don't want to have the speakers in the hotel ceiling and rely on that for your auction. In fact, I can tell you in 20 years of doing auctions, roughly, one time did that work. And in that case, it was one of those crowds that's quiet. You know, there's one client that comes to mind that they are the kind of room that sits back, their hands in their lap, and they sit there and watch the auctioneer. It's like I'm on a performance for a symphony or something. You know, they just sit there quietly and watch the auction. But my gosh, that's not what most events are like. Especially, to go back to my earlier remarks, we've got these schools that are coming together, especially younger kids. Well, I shouldn't even say that, high school too, but I don't know. For some reason, it seems like the younger kid, you go up to 8th grade, these parents are excited to be out of the house. The kids are with a babysitter. They're chit-chatting with everybody. They know each other and they're very social. This is social. So going back to Bruce's remarks, it's a small rock concert in there. Think about when you go to a rock concert, how difficult it is to even talk to the person next to you so that they can hear with clarity and distinction. So now we've got to get this over the din of the room. So that's where he talked about it. He says, look, the overhead speakers aren't going to do it. You've got to get those speakers down more at ear level. And generally that's, you know, they're putting those speakers at 6-7 feet or so, and that sound is coming out. It might be speakers all along the side of the room. It might be 4 speakers, kind of 2 up at the front and 2 halfway back. Depending on the size of the room, you have 200 people, they're relatively a moderate, quiet group. You could have 2 speakers at the front, sure. But if you start getting people who are kind of loud and having a good time, and there's going to be music later, and there's going to be dancing going on, you've got to enhance your sound system. You're going to have to write a check bigger than you probably want to in order to get the sound. Now, some auctioneers will bring their own sound system. I know auctioneers who will haul their sound system to different locations. I travel a lot on a plane. I don't want to be responsible for that. I am not going to be hauling a sound system to Wisconsin or, you know, Arizona or wherever I happen to be going. I'm just not going to do it. And for that matter, even here in DC, then that's something else I need to worry about. I'm setting up a sound system and I just don't want to deal with it. But there are some auctioneers who will bring in a sound system. So that might be something that you could ask if this is something that's important for you. And depending on this, they're going to know their sound system. So they'll know the strength of it. Like, will this accommodate 200 people, 300 people, an outdoor facility? All of that, they'll know. So they'll be able to work with you on that piece of it. But even some of them are going to say, whoa, your room is too big, or it's too difficult, or you got 2 different locations going on. I am not set up to manage all of that. You need to hire a company. You need to hire a sound company. And there's some auctioneers who, they make sure that the specs for the sound come across their desk and they sign off on it before they'll even go up that night. It's like, I want to see what you got for this room. I'm not going to show up that night unless I've spec'd it out for you. I don't go to that extreme either, but some do. So that just gives you an idea of how important sound is for your space. So what happens when you've got a sound system that is not accommodating, right? The people at the front are getting blasted out because you've cranked the speakers as loud as you can. So they're like, ah. And meanwhile, you've got people halfway down and back who can't even hear anything. And that's all they hear all night long. That's not fun. That's not fun. So there's a couple of things that I know that happens in that sort of environment. First, I, as the auctioneer, will start to slow down. And I start to slow down in both my just regular speaking like this. I start to explain. I'm giving time for those sound waves and clarity and distinction to kind of make their way. And if I talk too rapidly, all of that starts to run together and they can't hear it. So I start to slow down. What does that do? It slows down the auction. What happens as well in the sales cycle of each item, it slows it down too, because I know I've got donors in the room. This guy over here has just donated his beach house. This one over here has just, he's got a dinner party going on at his house. They're sitting in the room and they may not even be paying attention to the rest of the items, but rest assured, when their item comes up to bid, they're paying attention. They're, who's bidding on my stuff and what does it sell for? And did that auctioneer shortchange me? And I'm not going to have any donors sit there and say I shortchanged them. So I'm taking the time to make sure that we've got all the bids are in, people understand where we are, that we're all straight on our money. So it slows me down. But the other thing that it does is it disengages the room. People will get up, they'll walk to the bar, they'll start talking louder at their table. So now you've got a double problem, because first they couldn't hear, but now they're creating more din in the room, more congestion, sound congestion in the room, that even makes it worse for everyone else to hear. So it's this double whammy that the crowd throws at you when they can't hear. They'll start chatting, creates more volume, harder to hear now. Now maybe even the third row can't hear because the fourth and fifth rows are so loud. It's just a mess. So this sound issue is something that we really need to tackle. And it's not an inexpensive check. It's a big check. I'll set that up right now. But what happens when you don't do that? You lose money. You lose money. Now, how much money do you lose? That's harder to tell. That's harder to nail down. I can tell you that this past weekend, our live auction was great, but our fund a need suffered, because in this event, we had it at the end, which is fine. You can put it at the end. You can put it, it depends on the number of items that you have as to whether or not it should go at the beginning or the middle or the end or whatever. And this was at the end, and in normal circumstances, it would have been fine there. In hindsight, we probably should have put it at the front. If getting money out of the fund a need was the most important, that would have been the right place to put it, because at least they're still sort of engaged at this point. They haven't given up all hope. The audience hasn't, from the sound perspective. So you might be able to gather more money before they start drifting off because they can't hear. And then the live auction, again, loud and raucous. I can't think. I can't remember how to pronounce that word. So anyway, they just become more animated. That's another way to say it. They become more animated. What I'm going to encourage you to do is to look at your sound system. If you are new to a facility, talk to the facility, ask them if they have brought in, if anyone, ask to speak to other groups that have been in that space before, and then talk to those groups and say, did you have a problem with sound? What did you use? Did you bring an outside company? What went on over there? Internally, if you're in a hotel, and this is something that I hear sometimes, and I'll tell you how we used to deal with it. When you go to a hotel, they naturally want to sell their in-house sound. They've got a company there that they're contracted with. When that company books sound, then a portion of that revenue goes back to the hotel. So it's very much to the hotel's interest that you use their sound system. But the people that work in that hotel, it's usually a third company vendor. That company, again, they're dealing with overhead speakers. They may have extra speakers to bring out, but it's not their business. They're already looped in through the hotel, so they've kind of got a built-in revenue source right there. The reality is that if sound is important to you, and in an auction, it's important, I hope I conveyed that, then you need to be looking at outside vendors. So if you say, well, Sherry, they put it right into their contract that we have to use their sound. No, you don't. No, you don't. At GE, we used to cross that out. This is all in the negotiation stage of the hotel. You cross that out and you said, we will consider using the in-house sound, but we will also consider using outside vendors. So everybody's going to be able to compete for our work. Everybody can compete. The in-house company can, and the outside company, and then we reserve the right to make a decision because our event is important and we can't trust exactly what you've got or what you will do. I mean, you don't put all that into the contract, but the point being is that you can negotiate that. Don't just sign on the dotted line of what they give you. Cross that out and say, we reserve the right to compare and contrast, and then we'll make a decision. Yeah, we'll consider your in-house vendor, but we're not just going to sign up right here and say that we're going to go with it. We are booking you, hotel, because of your beautiful venue space. We are not booking you, hotel, because of whoever you've decided you get a better deal with on your third party vendor. It's important to you as an auction committee to have great sound. So don't shortchange yourself in this. It's going to be a check that you're going to have to write. Or like I said, you got some other options there. Maybe your auctioneer does sound. Maybe there's some maybe you've got a really quiet group. Maybe you're part of the 1%ers out there who have one of those groups who sit back, hands in lap, and watch the auctioneer. Nonprofit events tend to be more quiet than school events. Catholic schools tend to be the loudest. I don't think I'm throwing any surprises there to anybody, but generally speaking, younger parents tend to be louder than older parents, but it depends on the number of people you got in that room too. I got a high school that has a bunch of parents in it. They've got 700-800 people that come to that event. It's a loud event. That's a loud event too. Depends on the space. Is it hard surfaces or soft? Is that sound bouncing off the glass and the marble and the columns and the ceiling? Is it a high ceiling? Is it a low ceiling? Are there drapes, heavy drapes that are absorbing the sound to make it sound better too? All of that plays into it, way beyond the scope of my expertise. I just know when I show up whether or not it's going to work or not. The other thing too, I'll just drop in here. I know this is a long video, but it's important. Is that if you have someone on site, because I have worked some events too, where they'll drop off, set up the sound, and then they leave. Now, for one of my schools, that's fine. They've got about 110, 120 people that come. It's set up theater style. The crowd talks, but not a lot. That's fine for them. But if you've got somebody on site who's actually managing that sound and equipment, working on a soundboard, that's way better for you. Way better for you. Okay. I'm going to include here, when I post this on YouTube, I'm going to include a couple of blog posts that I've written about AV companies in the past so that you can refer to that if of interest. This is something that I've talked about for many years. But again, I think because we're coming out of COVID now, we're starting to see some of these families who've never been to an in-person event, some of these gala chairs who've never worked an in-person event, now coming to work in person, they just don't realize the importance of sound. So I think it's going to be a hot issue here in 2022. And I want to get us out here early in April to make sure that we are making the investments we need to so that we have some successful fundraising. Okay. For other information, you can head over to redappleauctions.com. As always, good luck to you in your fundraising auction.